The Duke of Hafford stood alone at the altar. 300 guests waited beneath glittering chandeliers. A bishop cleared his throat. The orchestra held a trembling final note. But the bride never came. Whispers began like a ripple across silk gowns and polished boots. Where is Lady Genevieve? Surely she is delayed. Someone should send for her. Then a cry burst from the corridor. She's gone. The words struck the chapel like thunder. The doors at the back still swayed slightly, as though someone had fled only moments before. Christopher Hale, Duke of Hafford, did not move. Not when the bishop stammered. Not when the guests began murmuring in disbelief. Not even when the Earl of Ashbourne, Genevieve's father, turned pale with humiliation before half the aristocracy of London. Christopher simply stared at the empty doorway where his bride should have appeared. His face remained carved from marble, but his eyes, cold, pale as winter frost, betrayed something no one expected. Pain, a deep, quiet fracture in a man believed incapable of feeling anything at all. And somewhere beyond the chapel walls, Lady Genevieve Marlowe ran. She did not remember the road, only the sound of her own breath. The lace of her wedding gown dragged through mud and fallen leaves as she fled through the gardens behind the chapel. Her satin slippers vanished somewhere along the path. Branches tore at her veil. Still she ran, because stopping meant turning back, and turning back meant surrendering the rest of her life. By the time she reached the carriage road, the bells of the chapel had begun to ring, calling the congregation to a wedding that would never happen. She did not cry, not yet, but one image burned itself into her memory forever. The Duke of Hafford standing before the altar, still, silent, watching the door she had just abandoned. She had expected fury in that gaze, humiliation, cold aristocratic pride. She had not expected sorrow, and that single human expression nearly made her turn back. Nearly, but fear pushed her forward. Fear of waking beside a stranger. Fear of smiling through a marriage arranged by two powerful families. Fear of slowly disappearing inside a life that belonged to everyone except her. So she chose ruin, and ruin followed her. 2 years later, Hampshire. The estate of her late Aunt Constance sat hidden among ancient oaks and misted fields. It was quiet here. No balls, no gossiping salons, no whispered scandal echoing through drawing rooms. Just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of old wooden floors. Lady Genevieve Marlowe had become a ghost in the countryside. Society had not forgiven her. Victorian England did not forgive women who humiliated dukes. But here no one asked questions. The villagers knew only that a quiet young lady lived in the old estate. She read books, walked the gardens, and kept mostly to herself. On certain evenings she would sit beside the window as dusk settled over the hills. And sometimes, only sometimes, she touched the small gold ring, resting inside a velvet box. The wedding ring she had never worn, cold gold. A promise buried before it was ever spoken. She had convinced herself she had made the right choice. Freedom was worth the price, even if freedom came with loneliness, even if some nights felt unbearably quiet, even if she sometimes remembered the Duke's eyes at the altar, and wondered what kind of man he truly was beneath all that iron restraint. But those thoughts belonged to another life, a life she had abandoned, or so she believed. One October evening, a carriage appeared at the iron gates. Genevieve noticed it from the garden path. The horses were tall, the carriage black and polished, and on its door gleamed a crest she knew far too well. Her heart stopped. The Hafford crest. Impossible. The carriage door opened. A tall man stepped down slowly onto the gravel. Even from across the garden she recognized him instantly. Christopher Hale, Duke of Hafford. He looked different, thinner, more tired. The proud, arrogant society feared still sharpened the line of his jaw, but something else lingered in his eyes now. Weariness, and something far more dangerous. Determination. Genevieve's pulse thundered as he crossed the garden. Dead leaves crunched beneath his boots. Every step felt like the approach of judgment itself. When he finally reached the door, he knocked once. Firm, measured, unavoidable. Her hands trembled as she opened it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. 2 years of silence stood between them like a wall. At last he removed his hat. Lady Genevieve, he said quietly. His voice was deeper than she remembered, roughened by time. I need to speak with you. Her instinct screamed to close the door, to protect the fragile life she had built from the past she had escaped. But something in his expression stopped her. Not anger, not pride. Something far more unsettling. Vulnerability. Every instinct told her that allowing him inside would change everything. And perhaps that was exactly why she stepped aside. You may come in, she said softly. But only for a few minutes. Christopher crossed the threshold slowly, as though entering a place sacred and dangerous. The small drawing room was modest. Faded rugs, old furniture, a fire not yet lit, nothing like the opulent estates he commanded. Genevieve folded her arms near the hearth. armor for a battle she never wished to fight again. "Why are you here?" she asked. Christopher turned toward her. For a long moment he simply studied her face, as if confirming she was real. Then he spoke the words that shattered the fragile calm of the room. "I cannot live," he said quietly, "without knowing why you ran from me." And Genevieve felt the past rise like a storm she had never truly escaped. For 2 years, Christopher Hale had imagined this moment. He had imagined anger, cold explanations, perhaps even indifference. But he had not imagined silence. Genevieve stood beside the hearth as though bracing herself against a winter wind, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had turned pale. "I cannot tell you," she said quietly. Christopher felt something twist in his chest. "Cannot," he repeated softly. "Or will not?" Her gaze flickered toward the window. Both. The answer should have infuriated him. A duke was not accustomed to being denied anything, least of all the truth about a scandal that had humiliated him before half the aristocracy of England. Yet anger did not come. Only exhaustion. He stepped forward once. She stepped back immediately. The movement stopped him like a raised blade. "I did not come here to harm you," Christopher said. His voice had lost the command it once carried. "I came for peace." Genevieve's lips trembled. "Peace?" she whispered. "Yes." He looked around the modest room. The worn rugs, the faded curtains, the absence of servants waiting at attention. Nothing about this place resembled the life she had been raised for. Nothing resembled the life she had almost married into. "You left me before the altar," he continued quietly. "For 2 years I have lived with a single question." His voice lowered. "Why?" The words seemed to settle into the floorboards. Genevieve's shoulders sank slightly as though the weight of it had been pressing upon her all this time. "I was afraid," she said at last. Christopher blinked. He had expected many things. Cruelty, rejection, even contempt. But not this. "Afraid of what?" he asked. She looked at him then, really looked. At the tall, controlled man whose presence had once terrified London ballrooms. "At you," she whispered. The words landed between them like a dropped blade. Christopher's expression hardened slightly. "I have never harmed you." "I know," she said quickly. That was never the fear. A fragile silence followed. Genevieve moved slowly toward the window, her fingers resting against the cool glass. "The truth," she said quietly, "is that I did not know you." Christopher felt the words settle deeper than any accusation. "You were a duke," she continued. "A powerful man chosen for me by families who believed titles and alliances were enough to build a marriage." She turned toward him again. "But I did not know what kind of man you were." Her voice trembled slightly, and I was terrified that I never would. Christopher stood perfectly still, because every word she spoke was painfully familiar. On the night before their wedding, he too had stood alone in his chambers, staring at his own reflection, wondering what kind of husband he was meant to be. A duke knew how to command estates, how to debate policy, how to maintain reputation, but no one had ever taught him how to love a woman. "I thought," Genevieve continued softly, "that if I married you I would wake every morning beside a stranger." The fire crackled faintly in the hearth, and slowly, she said, I would disappear. Christopher lowered his gaze. For 2 years he had blamed her, for humiliation, for scandal, for destroying the illusion of control he had spent his life cultivating. But standing here now, he realized something uncomfortable. She had not been the only one afraid. "You were right," he said quietly. Genevieve looked at him in surprise. Christopher ran a hand through his dark hair. "I did not know you either." She blinked. "You admit that?" "Yes." A bitter smile touched his mouth. "I was raised to believe marriages were arrangements. Practical decisions. 2 families, 2 estates, a proper alliance." His voice lowered. "I never once asked what you wanted." The room fell silent again. Genevieve studied him carefully now, as though seeing him for the first time. "You sound different," she said slowly. Christopher gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "That is because I am." He hesitated, then said the words he had never confessed to anyone. 3 months ago I was meant to marry another woman." Genevieve froze. "A second engagement?" "Yes." "Lady Helena Whitcomb." Her expression tightened. "A perfect match," she murmured. "Exactly," Christopher said. "Our families approved. Society approved. Everything was arranged. And yet," she said slowly, "you are not married." Christopher's gaze drifted toward the fading autumn light outside the window. "Because on the morning of the wedding," he said quietly, "I stood in the chapel again." Genevieve's breath caught. "And suddenly," he continued, "I saw your face." The memory seemed to move through him like a shadow. You walking away. The empty doorway. The silence. He looked back at her. "And I understood." Genevieve's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Understood what?" "That if I married that woman—" Christopher paused. I would be condemning her to the same prison you escaped. The words hung between them. Heavy, honest, and for the first time since he had arrived, Genevieve's expression softened. You ran too, she said quietly. Christopher nodded once. Yes. A strange sound escaped her then, not quite laughter, not quite disbelief. 2 scandals, she murmured. Christopher's mouth curved faintly. Society would say we are both cowards. Genevieve tilted her head slightly. Perhaps. Then her voice softened. Or perhaps we are the only 2 people who refuse to lie. Christopher looked at her. Really looked. And in that moment he understood something he had not expected. He had not come here seeking revenge, or explanations. He had come because somewhere deep inside him, he had never stopped wondering about the woman who had been brave enough to walk away. Genevieve had not expected him to stay. After such a conversation, most men, especially dukes, would have left with stiff dignity and a cold farewell. Christopher did not. When dusk settled over the Hampshire hills and Mrs. Peaton brought tea with visible suspicion toward the unexpected guest, he remained quietly seated near the window. Not like a duke inspecting a tenant's drawing room, more like a traveler who had wandered somewhere unfamiliar and did not quite wish to leave. Genevieve poured the tea slowly. The porcelain cups clinked softly against their saucers, a strangely domestic sound. Thank you, Christopher said. The simple gratitude startled her more than any display of authority could have. She sat across from him, a careful distance. Outside, wind stirred the branches of the old oaks surrounding the estate. Inside, silence stretched between them. It was Christopher who broke it. Where are you staying? She asked. At the Thornley Inn, he replied. The one 3 miles down the road? Yes. Genevieve blinked. That place barely has 2 proper guest rooms. Christopher shrugged faintly. It is quiet. And no one bows when I enter. Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. You find that comforting? I find it peaceful. For a moment, neither spoke. Genevieve understood that feeling more than she wished to admit. 2 years earlier, she had fled London precisely to escape the suffocating weight of expectation. Titles, reputation, judgment. Here she was simply Genevieve, not the scandalous bride who had abandoned a duke at the altar. How long will you remain? She asked quietly. Christopher hesitated. As long as you will allow it. Her fingers tightened around the teacup. That sounds dangerous. He smiled faintly. I thought you valued honesty. I do. But honesty can also be inconvenient. Christopher studied her expression. Careful, guarded, still ready to retreat at the slightest pressure. I will leave if you wish it, he said calmly. But I would prefer to stay. Genevieve's pulse quickened. The sensible choice would be to send him away immediately. His presence threatened the fragile peace she had spent 2 years building. Yet another voice inside her, quieter but persistent, whispered something else. Curiosity. She wanted to understand the man sitting across from her, not the Duke of Havard. But Christopher. Very well, she said at last. His eyebrows lifted slightly. You may stay. Under conditions. I expected nothing less. She placed her teacup carefully on the table. No titles, she said. No, your grace. No servants attending you here. Christopher leaned back slightly. And who will I be then? She held his gaze. Christopher. And you? Genevieve. He considered this for a moment, then slowly nodded. Agreed. Something shifted between them then. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but the beginning of something quieter, something far more uncertain. The next morning, the October sun rose pale over the Hampshire fields. Genevieve stepped into the garden expecting solitude. Instead, she found Christopher already there. He stood beside the tangled rose beds, sleeves rolled to his elbows, studying the wilderness of thorns with thoughtful concentration. You rise early, she observed. He turned. I always have. His eyes moved over the garden. Though I suspect the roses have not been tended in some time. They have not, she admitted. I lack a gardener. Christopher stepped closer to the nearest patch of brambles. It would be a shame to let them die. They are stubborn, she replied. They refuse to die. He smiled slightly. Then they deserve assistance. Before she could respond, he removed his coat and draped it over a low branch. What are you doing? She asked. Helping. You are a duke. And? Genevieve folded her arms. Dukes do not usually dig in the soil. Christopher picked up a rusted pair of shears resting near the garden wall. Perhaps they should. Then he knelt and began cutting away the dead branches. For a moment she simply stared. The image was so absurd that a laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Christopher glanced up. I assume that was ridicule. It was surprise. There. He returned to the roses. Genevieve hesitated, then slowly stepped beside him. Together they began clearing the tangled garden. At first they worked in silence. But gradually the quiet changed. It became easier, less guarded. Genevieve spoke about her late Aunt Constance, about the loneliness of the estate, about the nearby village where no one asked questions about her past. Christopher listened, truly listened. He did not interrupt, did not judge, simply absorbed every word as though it mattered. Eventually she asked softly, "And you?" He paused, hands resting on the rake. "What about me? What did you do these past 2 years?" Christopher looked down at the earth beneath his boots. "I survived," he said. "I managed estates, attended Parliament, fulfilled every obligation expected of a duke." His voice lowered slightly, but inside, he exhaled slowly. I felt frozen. Genevieve's chest tightened. "So did I," she admitted. They looked at each other then, two people who had lived the same silent exile in different worlds. Christopher gave a faint smile. "Perhaps we can help each other thaw." Genevieve did not answer, but as she knelt beside him in the soft October sunlight, something inside her shifted. For the first time in 2 years, she did not feel entirely alone, and that realization frightened her more than anything. Christopher had intended to remain only a few days, a week at most. Yet time at the Hampshire estate moved strangely. Mornings passed in the garden where stubborn roses slowly returned to life beneath careful hands. Afternoons were spent in the small drawing room where Genevieve read beside the window while he wrote letters he never quite finished. Evenings brought tea, quiet conversation, and sometimes nothing but the comforting presence of another soul in the room. It was a life Christopher had never known. There were no rigid expectations, no council meetings, no endless parade of aristocratic obligations, only silence, honest and gentle. For the first time since childhood, he felt something dangerously close to peace. But peace had a way of loosening guarded thoughts, and one afternoon, while Genevieve sat reading near the fire, a question slipped from him before he could stop it. "Do you regret it?" She looked up slowly. "Regret what?" Christopher leaned against the mantel. "Running away." The room fell very still. Genevieve closed the book in her lap, her fingers lingering on its worn leather cover. Outside, wind stirred the branches of the old oaks. Inside, the question waited. "Every day," she said softly. Christopher felt a strange tightening in his chest. "And not a single one." He frowned slightly. "That sounds contradictory." "It is," she admitted. She rose and walked toward the window, staring out over the quiet garden they had slowly begun to restore. "I regret the scandal," she said. "The humiliation it caused you. My father's anger. My mother's disappointment." Her voice lowered, "And the way I left without a word." Christopher said nothing, because those wounds were real. But then she turned toward him, her gaze steady now. "But I do not regret choosing truth." The words landed with quiet force. "If I had married you," she continued gently, "something inside me would have died." Christopher felt the truth of it like a blow. He had imagined her life as his duchess many times. Graceful, elegant, perfectly composed beside him at endless dinners and social events. He had never imagined the cost of that image. "You would not have died," he said quietly. Genevieve gave a sad smile. "Perhaps not in body, but in spirit." Her eyes met his, "And you would never have noticed." Christopher lowered his gaze, because he knew she was right. At 28, he had been a man trained for command, not understanding. He would have mistaken obedience for happiness, and silence for peace. "I would have erased you," he admitted quietly. Genevieve shook her head gently, not intentionally. "But yes." The words hung between them. Heavy, honest. Christopher turned toward the window, needing a moment to breathe. Outside, the garden showed the first fragile signs of life. Green shoots pushing through soil that had once been neglected. "Genevieve," he said slowly, "what if we began again?" The silence behind him was immediate and absolute. He turned. She had gone pale. "What do you mean?" she asked. Christopher ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with his own lack of clarity. "I mean, these past days. They have been different. Real." He took a slow step toward her. "For the first time in my life, I'm not performing for anyone. I am simply living." His voice lowered. "And I do not wish to lose that." Genevieve's breath trembled slightly. "Christopher, you make me feel alive," he said. The words escaped before he could stop them. Her reaction was immediate. She stepped back as though burned. "You cannot say such things." "Why not?" "Because they are not real." Christopher stared at her. "They feel real to me." "You have been here 1 week," she replied sharply. 1 week away from the world you belong to. Soon you will return to London, to Parliament, to your estates, to the life waiting for you." Her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "And I will become nothing more than a pleasant memory." Christopher felt something stubborn rise inside him. That is not what I want. Genevieve shook her head. You do not know what you want. I know I do not want to leave you. Her eyes flashed. You are not in love with me. The statement landed like a verdict. You are in love with freedom. With the idea of escape. With a life without expectations. She took a slow breath. But that is not love. Christopher hesitated, because a small, uncomfortable voice inside him wondered if she might be right. Yet something deeper pushed him forward. Then give me time. Genevieve froze. To prove you wrong, he said quietly. For a long moment she simply stared at him. Fear, hope, uncertainty, all warring behind her eyes. And if you fail, she asked. Christopher stepped closer, close enough that the quiet warmth of her presence filled the space between them. Then I will leave. The words were calm, certain, and I will never trouble you again. Genevieve's hands trembled slightly. And if you succeed? Christopher's voice softened. Then perhaps we will both discover that second chances are not as impossible as we believed. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Finally she spoke. 1 week, she said. Christopher blinked. You may stay 1 more week. And after that? Genevieve held his gaze. We decide. Christopher nodded slowly. We decide. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both understood something dangerous had begun. Not love. Not yet, but possibility. And possibility, Christopher realized, could be the most frightening thing of all. The letter arrived on a gray morning heavy with rain. Genevieve recognized the seal the moment Mrs. Peaton placed it on the breakfast table. The Marlowe crest, her father's. Her stomach tightened. For 2 years, no letter had come from that house. 2 years of silence so complete it had felt like exile. Now the past had found her again. Christopher noticed the change in her expression immediately. You look as though you have seen a ghost, he said gently. Genevieve did not answer. She broke the seal slowly. The paper trembled in her hands as she read. The words were brief, brutally simple. Genevieve, your mother is gravely ill. The physicians believe her time may be short. She asks to see you. Come if you are able. Your father. The room seemed to tilt. For a moment, Genevieve could not breathe. 2 years of silence. 2 years of rejection. And now, when death approached, they remembered she existed. Christopher stepped closer. Is it serious? Genevieve nodded faintly. My mother is dying. The words felt unreal in her mouth. Christopher read the letter quietly. When he finished, he placed it gently back on the table. You must go, he said. Genevieve let out a shaky breath. I know. But fear twisted through her chest like ice. Then why do you look as though you cannot? She hesitated. Because I'm afraid. Christopher waited, afraid of seeing disappointment in her eyes. Genevieve whispered. Afraid of my father's anger? Afraid of walking back into that house where everyone remembers the woman who destroyed her family's honor. Christopher stepped closer. You are not that woman anymore. She looked up sharply. How would you know? His answer came without hesitation. Because I have watched you these past weeks. His voice was steady. You are stronger than the girl who ran from that chapel. Genevieve's throat tightened. You make it sound simple. It is not simple, he said quietly. But it is necessary. She stared at the letter again. The ink had blurred slightly where a tear had fallen without her noticing. Come with me, she said suddenly. Christopher blinked. To your family's estate? Genevieve nodded. I do not think I can face them alone. The request surprised them both. For a moment, Christopher said nothing. He understood exactly what such a journey would mean. Her father would despise him. Society would whisper even louder. But none of that mattered. If you wish it, he said gently, I will come. Relief washed across her face. They left the next morning. The sky was heavy with rain as a modest hired carriage carried them north. The roads were muddy and slow. Inside the carriage, silence filled the small space between them. Genevieve watched the countryside blur past the window. With every mile, the past grew closer. Christopher studied her quietly. Do you regret asking me to come? He asked at last. She turned toward him. No. He nodded. Good. She hesitated. Do you regret agreeing? Christopher smiled faintly. Your father will likely attempt to throw me out of the house. That is very possible. And yet, he continued calmly, I find I do not particularly mind. Genevieve laughed softly. The sound surprised them both. By nightfall, the carriage rolled beneath the iron gates of the Marlowe estate. The great house loomed ahead, tall and solemn beneath the dark sky. Servants hurried forward with lanterns. Their expressions changed instantly when they recognized Genevieve. Shock, discomfort, curiosity. The old butler stiffened visibly. Lady Genevieve, he said carefully. His gaze shifted toward Christopher. And His Grace? The name echoed faintly through the hall as they entered. A moment later, footsteps sounded on the staircase. Lord Marlowe appeared at the top. He looked older than Genevieve remembered. His shoulders stooped slightly with age, but the anger in his eyes had not faded. When he saw Christopher, his face drained of color. "You," he said sharply. "How dare you come into this house?" Genevieve lifted her chin. "He came at my request." "A request?" her father repeated with disbelief. "This man is the reason our family became a laughingstock." Christopher stepped forward calmly. "With respect, my lord, I believe your daughter's actions were her own." Lord Marlowe's eyes flashed. "And why are you here now?" Christopher did not hesitate. "Because she asked me to stand beside her." Silence filled the hall. Genevieve felt something shift inside her chest. Not love, not yet, but something close to awe. Christopher had known exactly what this moment would bring, and he had come anyway, and in that instant Genevieve understood something she had never expected. For the first time in her life, someone had chosen to stand beside her no matter the cost. Christopher knew the moment he stepped into the chamber that Lady Marlowe was dying. The room smelled faintly of lavender and candle wax, the quiet perfume of a house preparing for loss. Heavy curtains dimmed the afternoon light. The once elegant woman lay pale against the pillows, her breathing shallow and uneven. But when her eyes found Genevieve standing at the doorway, something fragile sparked back to life. "Genevieve," she whispered. The single word broke the fragile control Genevieve had held since arriving. She crossed the room quickly and fell to her knees beside the bed. "I'm here, Mother," she said, her voice trembling. "I came." Lady Marlowe's thin hand lifted slowly, brushing against her daughter's cheek. For a moment she simply studied Genevieve's face, as though memorizing every detail. "You look stronger," she murmured. Genevieve tried to smile. "I learned how." A weak breath escaped the older woman. "Good." Her gaze shifted slowly across the room until it settled on Christopher standing quietly near the door. "Your Grace." Christopher stepped forward immediately. He lowered himself beside the bed, abandoning all aristocratic distance. "Lady Marlowe." She regarded him for a long moment. Then something unexpected happened. She smiled. "Thank you," she whispered. Christopher frowned slightly. "For what?" "For coming with her." Genevieve blinked, surprised. Lady Marlowe's voice was faint now, but steady. "My daughter has always been brave," she said. "Too brave for the world she was born into." A quiet cough shook her chest. "I was not." Genevieve squeezed her hand. "Mother?" "No," Lady Marlowe continued gently. "It is time to speak honestly." Her gaze moved between them. "I married your father because it was expected. I smiled at the proper dinners. I played the part society required." Her voice softened, and every day a small piece of me disappeared. Tears slid down Genevieve's face. "I never wanted that for you." "Then why didn't you stop it?" she whispered. Lady Marlowe's eyes closed briefly. "Because I was afraid." The admission hung quietly in the room. When she opened her eyes again, they rested on Christopher. "Take care of her." Christopher felt the weight of those words settle heavily in his chest. "Not out of duty," she added, "but out of love." His throat tightened. "I promise." The simple vow carried more sincerity than any oath he had ever spoken in Parliament. Lady Marlowe nodded faintly. Satisfied. Within the hour her breathing slowed. Genevieve held her hand as the final breath slipped quietly into the stillness of the room. When it was over, she collapsed forward. Christopher caught her immediately, holding her as silent sobs shook her shoulders. He did not speak. There were no words for grief, so he simply remained beside her. The days that followed blurred together. Black mourning ribbons appeared on the doors. Servants moved quietly through dim corridors. Visitors arrived with polite condolences and carefully measured sympathy. Genevieve drifted through it all like a shadow. Christopher stayed close, never demanding attention, never leaving her alone. On the final evening before they returned to Hampshire, Genevieve slipped into the garden behind the estate. Christopher followed a few minutes later. She stood beside the rose bushes her mother had planted years before. Autumn had stripped them bare. "She was never happy," Genevieve said softly. Christopher stepped beside her. "She told me." Genevieve wrapped her arms around herself. She lived exactly the life society demanded. And in the end, she regretted it. Christopher studied the dark garden. "Then perhaps she gave you something important." Genevieve looked up. "What?" "Permission." She frowned slightly. "To live differently." The words lingered between them. "What if I fail?" she whispered. "What if courage is not enough?" Christopher turned toward her. He lifted his hands gently, cupping her face. The gesture was intimate, unplanned. "If you fail," he said quietly, "then at least you will have truly lived." His voice softened. There is no greater tragedy than a life spent pretending. Genevieve stared at him. Grief still shimmered in her eyes, but beneath it something else had begun to grow. Trust. Thank you, she whispered, for being here. Christopher drew her carefully into his arms. For the first time she did not resist. I will not leave you, he said softly, and as Genevieve leaned into his embrace beneath the cold autumn sky, something shifted between them. Not yet, love. But the unmistakable beginning of it. Hampshire felt quieter when they returned, perhaps because grief still lingered inside Genevieve like an echo, or perhaps because everything between her and Christopher had changed. The house felt different. The garden they had rebuilt together seemed fuller, softer somehow beneath the pale winter sunlight. Yet Genevieve kept her distance, not deliberately, not cruelly, but cautiously. Christopher noticed. Of course he did. He had learned to read the smallest shifts in her silence. So he waited. Days passed. Then one morning Genevieve finally stepped into the garden again. Christopher was already there, turning the soil near the rose beds they had once rescued together. He did not look up immediately, giving her the choice. Always giving her the choice. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. Christopher lifted his head. For what? For hiding. He brushed dirt from his hands. You were grieving. That is not an excuse. Her eyes lowered slightly. You stood beside me through the worst moment of my life, and I have barely spoken to you since. Christopher studied her gently. You did not need to speak. She stepped closer. But there is something I must say. The winter air felt still. I know what you told me before we left Hampshire, she continued. That you loved me. Christopher remained silent. I never answered you, she said softly. His expression did not change. I did not expect you to. But I have an answer now. Christopher's heartbeat quickened. Genevieve's voice trembled slightly. When I ran from that chapel 2 years ago, I believed freedom meant being alone. Her gaze met his. I believed love would trap me. She swallowed. But somewhere between that day and this moment, something changed. Christopher waited, afraid to breathe. You did not try to control me, she continued. You did not demand forgiveness. You simply stayed. Her eyes glistened, and I realized something frightening. Christopher stepped forward. What is that? Genevieve gave a faint, breathless smile. I'm no longer afraid of loving you. The words landed softly, yet they felt like thunder. Christopher crossed the remaining distance between them. Genevieve. She shook her head gently. Let me finish. Her voice steadied. I love you. Silence fell across the garden. Christopher stared at her as though the world had suddenly shifted beneath his feet. For a long time, she continued quietly, I believed love and freedom could not exist together. But you proved me wrong. Christopher exhaled slowly, emotion tightening his chest. You once ran from marrying me, he said softly. Genevieve nodded. Yes. And now? She stepped closer. Now I choose you. The simple certainty in her voice shattered the last restraint Christopher had been holding. Without warning, he dropped to one knee before her. Genevieve gasped. Christopher! I was supposed to kneel before you once before, he said quietly. His voice carried both humor and something deeper, but fate had other plans. From his coat pocket he withdrew a small velvet box. Genevieve's breath caught. This time, he said gently, I ask with no arrangements, no pressure, no expectations from society. He opened the box. Inside rested a simple gold ring. Only love. Christopher looked up at her. Lady Genevieve Marlowe. His voice softened. Will you marry me? Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. Yes, she whispered. Christopher blinked. Yes? She laughed through her tears. Yes. The word echoed across the quiet garden. Christopher rose quickly, pulling her into his arms. For a moment neither spoke, two souls who had nearly missed each other entirely. Now standing together in the winter sunlight. I promise you something, Christopher murmured against her hair. What? You will never lose yourself with me. Genevieve smiled softly. And you will never have to pretend again. He kissed her then, not the restrained gesture of aristocratic propriety, but a kiss filled with relief, devotion, and hard-won joy. And somewhere beyond the garden walls, society would gossip, scandals would whisper, but for the first time in their lives, neither of them cared, because this time when the Duke of Hafford knelt before Genevieve Marlowe, she did not run, she chose him, and that choice changed everything.